tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
Our fixed election date right now is on the books for October 2025. Now, I didn't give a specific date there because this is subject to change. Currently, the law says the election will be October 20th, 2025, but the Liberals are tabling an amendment to this that will push that date to October 27th. It will push it back 7 days. And you may think, okay, what's the big deal? I don't even know what I'm doing for dinner tonight, let alone what I'm doing in October of 2025. Well, why it matters is you have to look at the motivation. Why is the Liberal government changing this? Well, the Liberals say, and it's not untrue, by the way, that October 20th is the date of Diwali. Now, Diwali is the Hindu festival of lights. It's a very popular and very big celebration in the Hindu community, a large enough group in Canada. Having this election on that holiday would be disruptive. We move elections around for Jewish holidays and Christian holidays, so that in and of itself is not inherently unbelievable. But they could move it a week earlier. They could move it 2 weeks earlier. They chose to move it a week later. Now, something happens between October 20th, 2025 and October 27th, 2025. Something happens in that span of 7 days. And what you may ask, well, that's a fantastic question. What happens is dozens more MPs become eligible for their gold-plated taxpayer-funded pensions. Yes, now it starts to become clear. Well, no offense to the Hindus in our audience, no offense to observers of Diwali, but I suspect your holiday has been less of an incentive for MPs to delay the election by 1 week than this little detail about pensions has been. And this is where we get into, what's the old Shakespearean line? There's the rub. Well, right here you have, and Canadian Taxpayers Federation and National Post both crunch the numbers on this. You have to be eligible for your MP pension, have 6 years of pensionable service. Now, I was actually a little bit confused by this, and I spent much of my morning poring over legislation. So you'll forgive me if I have a glazed over look in my eyes. I haven't ripped the glaze off from reading legislation. It's not from donuts, it's from reading legislation. But what happened is we saw that you needed 6 years of pensionable service. Now, I didn't actually know how they calculated that because MPs are elected on election day, but they're often not sworn in for several weeks after that, maybe even more than a month. Does pensionable service begin when you are elected or when you are sworn in? I would have assumed when you're sworn in because that is when your work begins. And similarly, when Parliament dissolves, you cease to be a member of Parliament. So do you stop amassing pensionable service time when Parliament's dissolved or on the election date if you lose? Now, as it happens, it goes from election to election. So even though you're not even serving as a member of Parliament for a good chunk of either end of that, you're actually amassing pension credit in that time period. Which means that, yes, 6 years, the amount of time it takes to qualify for your pension, 6 years is actually a threshold that dozens of MPs will cross between October 20th, 2025 and October 27th, 2025. Now, the MPs we're talking about are the ones who were elected in the 2019 election. Now, the elephant in the room here, most of those MPs were Conservatives because this was the election in which the Liberals, which had a majority government from 2011 or from 2015 to 2019, were knocked down to a minority. The Conservatives elected a couple of dozen more MPs. The Liberals elected some new ones as well, the Bloc Québécois, the NDP. There were lots of new faces. Conservatives have most of this, but not all of it. And why this is relevant is because you have here, I think in a lot of the cases, MPs that, look, the Conservatives aren't the ones changing the legislation. The Conservatives are the ones that are just there. The Liberals are the ones steering this ship. But you have Liberals that are motivated perhaps by realizing that they're not going to get much pushback from MPs that are retiring, are going to lose. Right now, all the polling is showing the Conservatives are on track to win a supermajority, which means that Liberals, NDP, and Bloc MPs all stand to lose. a little bit in the next election. So the MPs that were first elected in 2019 are getting very nervous right now. They don't want to lose their pensions. And you better believe, I think they care more about that than they care about Diwali. Kris Sims is the Alberta director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and joins me on the line now. Look, Kris, CTF has always been sounding the alarm about MP pensions. These things are absolute sweetheart deals. MPs get a better pension than pretty much anyone in the private sector in this country.
Yes.
But the more insidious part is how you know that they make decisions based on eligibility. Like, I know people make the criticism and no one can prove what's in someone's mind, but I'm convinced that Jagmeet Singh is motivated by his own pension eligibility in terms of keeping the government alive.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want to, dance around this. We put out the news release. Franco Terrazzano and his team there in Ottawa did an immense amount of work calculating these potential pensions. And again, this is the upper limit, right? It's the parameter that if all of them lost their seats, which is highly unlikely, this is how much the taxpayers would be on the hook for. So that's the mathematical part. But we have to notice the forest along with the trees here. And of course, this would play into somebody's decision whether or not they want to, say, continue to support the Trudeau government. If they're going to be lined up for a big pension in just a few more days, why not just hang in there? There are very few members of parliament who've been able to withstand that temptation. Credit where it's due. The former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, took a big hit on his personal pension. I can't remember how much money it was, but it was big time, like 7 figures, something like that, over his lifetime for his pension. So there are some members of parliament who do walk the talk, and they are in it for pension reform, but they're pretty few and far between.
Yeah, and I'll give those numbers you just alluded to that Franco crunched here. So there are 80 members of parliament who will become eligible in that week, who will become eligible on October 21st, 2025, 80 of them. Now, of those, I think it's about 30 or 33 that were conservative. So most of them, very few conservatives are saying they're not running again. A handful are. So most of them, given these polling numbers, are probably going to be staying around. But even if you look at the 50 of Liberals that aren't running again or will lose, NDPers who aren't running again or will lose, Bloc Québécois. These are all folks that will amass collectively tens of millions of dollars just by moving that election 1 week.
Yeah, exactly. And imagine that temptation. And so again, folks need to remember that the member of parliament will start getting a pension once they reach a certain age. And then you just do the basic calculation from there. You decide, how long are they going to live past then? Sorry to be grim, but that's what we have to do with mathematics and calculations. It's not personal. Are they going to live to 80, 85, 90? And then you go through all the different numbers of MPs, and that's how you do this math. And so I think that's why it's really important that Franco put out this piece this morning. So yes, we understand the politics and the chess match that is happening right now, but we also understand the math and the cost to taxpayers behind it. I think I just saw before we jumped on here, did the opposition leader Pierre Poilievre call this bluff and say that, no, let's move it up even earlier so we don't run into the religious ceremony and festival, but you're still not hitting the pension date? I think I saw that.
Yeah, I'm guess I'm just a little bit, well, take a step back. How do you think that plays out?
Have to see, right? So this is it. So, okay, taking off my CTF hat a little bit here. I was on Parliament Hill working there through a couple of different political blow-ups, you'd call it. So I remember when suddenly the Canadian Alliance, a lot of people within the Canadian Alliance lost faith in their leader, Stockwell Day. And a lot of party stalwarts got up and left, and they went and sat by themselves. I remember when Belinda Stronach, who actually ran for party leader, it's not like she was just some random no-name backbencher, when she dramatically crossed the floor, we all got to see Peter MacKay with his dog in his potato field. Like, politics sometimes isn't boring. My point of all of this is before that happened, everything seemed fine. So on the surface, the duck is cool and calm and collected, but underneath the surface, they're just going like this. And so everything's fine until it suddenly isn't. And so the same way that we saw the carbon tax vote, getting all of those members of parliament on the record, yay or nay, are you for or against the carbon tax increase? That was pressure. And I think, if I can just put on my hat a little bit here, I think that's what they're doing with this. He's calling a bluff. It's kind of a gangster move. And he's going to try to get everybody on the record whether or not they want to move the vote day. And so again, that's more pressure that's increasing on this hull. And so I think that's why they're doing that.
Yeah, and again, I gave my little civics one. Candace Malcolm always calls me the in-house political scientist because I just have a tendency to take all of these like salacious political topics and just frame them in the most boring technical terms possible. But I've said at any time there could be an election, so we're not bound by this. But that supply and confidence agreement with the NDP and the Liberals has been pretty ironclad so far. I mean, Justin Trudeau, I'm convinced, and you and I have spoken about this before, that he's a burn it all down on the way out kind of prime minister. I actually don't think he cares about his MPs' pensions. I think that he wants to just pick the moment that's going to be best for him. And if it costs a few dozen Liberal MPs their pensions, so be it. I don't think he cares. But I do think it says a lot about the entitlement mentality you see in the House of Commons and you see among MPs. And look, I'm not going to say Conservatives are immune. I mean, there were a lot of these fire-breathing reformers that were elected in the 90s and then alliance candidates in 2001 that were big crusaders against this sort of stuff, but then benefited from it the second they were in the door.
They sure did. And a lot of them were part of a majority government. And we didn't see a lot of dramatic reform. Again, credit where it's due. We did see some. Some folks are pretty sticklers to their principles. And so we did see some. But no, this has got nothing to do with the color of the jersey. This has got everything to do with power and money. And in this case, those who are currently holding on to power are in line for an awful lot of money for the rest of their lives, if only they move this little election date up just a little bit further. And so we'd be naive, we'd be silly to think that this does not play a role here. You mentioned Prime Minister Trudeau in this sense, and this is where I wanted to bring it back to political activism and peaceful grassroots activism. I was describing all the pressure these MPs are under, and we're seeing that with polls, right? We're seeing that with these votes. Another element for real is the pressure they're getting from constituents. And it's not just coming from Taxpayers Federation writers, but a lot of it is. If they keep getting this pressure from their constituents, right? So their middle bencher and backbencher MP, if they're getting a call from Mary and Joseph and Sahil from their constituencies saying, hey, man, I can barely afford this. I can't pay my hydro bill. I can't fill up my minivan and take my kids to school. I'm voting against you unless you smarten up. That really rings bells with these MPs. And what I'm hearing, some scuttlebutt from Parliament Hill, is that apparently, I don't know if this is true, apparently the Prime Minister is tuning out of his caucus more than he has before. And this has been a pretty late development. And regardless of political party, once a leader starts doing that and tuning out the people who are part of his team, if that's happening, things start getting bumpy. And so this is, again, why I would encourage people. And I would say the same thing if it was another party that was screwing you over on your taxes and trying to take your money. This is why it's important to keep up the pressure right now. Continue to
and we had heard something to that effect when the Liberals had their caucus retreat in London, which I only know of through other reporting because, as we perhaps recall, I was banned from covering it, even though it was, like 5 minutes from my house or whatever.
Were you kicked out of the city? Or were you allowed to stay in? Were you banned?
No, I was allowed to maintain my residency in London. They didn't go full like G20 on me and like ship me out. They didn't give me the old David Menzies and drive me out to the outskirts and dump me in a parking lot or anything. But they did say, you're not welcome here, and that's fine. But it's not fine, but I'm just moving on to what I wanted to say here, which was that we heard that Liberal MPs were quite frustrated with the status quo in their party. And again, how they have been so silent. I mean, hurting Conservatives is very, very, very difficult. I mean, Stephen Harper was probably the best at it, and even he had a lot of trouble with caucus members that were just a little bit rambunctious. Hurting Liberal, they are a conformist people. They fall in line. He has kept that caucus tight. There has only really been one criticism of him that is by someone who's still in that caucus, and that was a no-name Quebec MP. Others, like the second there's a bit of dissent, they're out the door. Jane Philpott, Jody Wilson-Raybould, Selena Caesar-Chavez, and as a result, everyone else just shuts up.
Yes, until recently. and until the carbon tax, which is again why I think this pressure is so important. And I keep coming back to it. I know we're geeking out here politically speaking, but the fact that the Atlantic caucus of the Liberal Party said, hey, Trudeau, we're not going to be paying this carbon tax here, boy. Like, all of our constituents are really mad at us. We've been hearing about it over the summer. And again, I have family there. I lived there. Okay. I know the culture. All of those little gatherings over the summer, they still call them box socials. I'm not kidding. And the picnics and all that stuff, they would have been hearing from a lot of their hardcore Liberal Party supporters in Atlantic Canada. And they got an earful. And they turned around and gave Prime Minister Trudeau an earful. And magic, he carves out a carbon tax exemption for their primary home heating fuel, which of course is oil. So for him to blink on that showed that there is a division within that caucus, that he will cave to pressure, and he had to admit that the carbon tax is a financial burden to people. So that was a major move. And the fact that the Environment Minister, Stéphane Guilbeault, was not at that meeting, I think that's the crack in the armor. So I would encourage everybody, just go at that and put pressure on that fissure.
We have a super chat from Marco here. He says, why is everybody against the Liberals? They made my house the best asset I have. Yes. You're one of those wealthy homeowners just because of inflation and all of that stuff. You mentioned Stephen Guilbeault, Kris. Let me play this clip of, let's just let the clip speak for itself here.
The plan that your government laid out post-2019, the 2019 election, got us to 2030 and the targets that you set out to 2030, and that is when the price on carbon will reach $170 a ton. Do you intend for that price to continue to go up, since you do see this as such an integral part of your climate policy beyond 2030 to help Canada reach its 2050 target?
So we haven't made a decision on that. We've started consultation to prepare the next phase of emission reduction, so post-2030 in Canada, in fact, going to 2035. Those consultations are ongoing. Canada will need to make a determination by next year, as per our United Nations commitment, to set those new targets for 2035. We will need to do that by next year, by 2025. There's no decision that has been made yet, other than we will continue increasing the price on pollution.
Oh, we don't yet know. Again, a lot of things here that are important to caveat, such as, are the Liberals going to be in power in 2030? I don't know. I mean, theoretically, even if they lose in 2025, they could be back in 2030. Yep. Crazy things happen. I do love the profound irony here of him giving a lecture on global warming. Well, he's like puffed up like the blueberry girl in Willy Wonka. Like he's like basically he's on the verge of just taking off the ground. He's so puffy while talking about how we need to tax more because it's so warm outside. Yeah, it's late March and you're basically Jigglypuff there with your big giant parka. But nevertheless, what do you make of that? I mean, literally, this is an infinite carbon tax and an infinitely increasing carbon tax to Stephen Guilbeault.
Yeah, I was noticing his likely down-filled parka there too. Looks pretty chilly. I would bring us back to the former Environment Minister. So Catherine McKenna, famously, before an election, said they had no plans to increase their carbon tax past $30 a ton. Remember that? Feels like it should be like with old-timey music and like sepia tone, right? And then magic, as soon as the election was over, up it went, and they announced it to $170 a ton. So folks, regardless of political party, again, I hate to break this to people, but I think I need to, because we're getting some feedback of, oh, well, look at the rebates. Look at the rebates. You're richer for it. Politicians sometimes don't tell the truth. They do this so often that we have a mascot for them that looks a lot like that Italian fable of the wooden boy who couldn't tell the truth and his nose kept growing. So they do this. And so for him to say, oh, well, we'll have to wait and see. Yeah, wait and see. So I think in this case, you just need to look back at his previous work history and his current behavior as Environment Minister. And will they continue to increase the carbon tax or the price on carbon or whatever they want to call it? You know, is water wet? Of course they will. Of course they will. The only thing that would stop them, I think, is a strong rebuke from their own constituents. Again, we would have to crack through that fissure of influence, I think, and get through to those members of parliament and get those members of parliament to convince their prime minister to change his ways on this. to say, hey, people are broke. They can't afford anything anymore. We have to, call a spade and do a full retreat on this. I'm always an optimist. I actually think that risk is not zero. I do think the politicians do change their mind when they realize their own job is on the line. This could happen because the NDP in British Columbia used to rail against the carbon tax. And now they love it that they're in government. The NDP here in Alberta imposed a carbon tax on Albertans without warning. And now most of their political candidates...
Oh, yeah, they're all scrambling to see who can oppose it the most. Yeah.
Yeah, right? So just, if you don't like the politics, wait 5 minutes, right? So I do still think that there's a chance of that, but we need to keep that clip because we need to remember what Guibo said there in the future.
All right. And if you are missing any feathers from your duvet, check Stephen Guilbeault's jacket. All right. Kris Sims, Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always a pleasure. We won't see you next Monday because it's Easter Monday, but we'll make it up somehow. Thanks so much.
Have a happy Easter. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.